Let your breath slow, like oars gliding across a quiet inlet. Tonight, we begin far before borders and flags, before the word America meant a place on maps. We begin in deep time, when oceans were lower, when a broad plain Beringia linked northeast Asia and northwest North America like a wind-cold bridge of grass, shrubs, and migrating herds. During the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, sea levels fell and exposed that land. People could live there, hunt there, and when ice thinned and roots opened, move beyond it into the vastness of a new world. Close your eyes and picture small groups edging south and east, sometimes along an ice-free corridor inland, sometimes slipping down the Pacific Rim by boat and shoreline camp. The dates are still debated, but many scholars place sustained human presence south of the great ice sheets between roughly 15 and 20,000 years ago. The story is layered, not one single march, but many journeys over generations, following animals, seasons, and stars. Archaeologists once gave pride of place to a toolkit found near Clovis, New Mexico, sleek, fluted stone points so finely made that their ridges catch moonlight like seams in glass. For decades, Clovis first framed the tale of the earliest Americans. New evidence, however, points to older sites along coasts and in caves, suggesting deeper roots. Even so, those Clovis points, dated to roughly the 11th millennium BCE, still speak of astonishing skill and mobility, a shared tradition spread across a continent. Imagine the quiet tap-tap of napping, the final flute struck from the base, the point fitted to a spear that would feed a family. As centuries flowed, people shaped landscapes as much as any river. In the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, communities raised earthen mounds with patient hands, ceremonial centers, burial places, and markers of shared life. Time moves on, and with it, cultures change. But one of the most breathtaking expressions would come much later in a city we call Cahokia. Around the 11th to 12th centuries CE, across the river from today's St. Louis, a metropolis in earth and wood rose from rich floodplain soil, grand plazas, neighborhoods, and more than 100 mounds, with the largest monk's mound looming like a man-made hill against the sky. Estimates suggest tens of thousands lived in and around it at its height. Drift to sleep imagining dawn on that plaza, smoke from cooking fires, the murmur of trade goods from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Not all connections ran inland. Far to the northeast, toward misty capes and spruce, there was, for a time, a wooden hall where voices spoke Old Norse. On the tip of Newfoundland lies L'Anse aux Meadows, a site of Soden timber buildings where Norse seafarers came around the early 11th century, evidence of ironworking, repairs, and voyages farther south. It was not a lasting colony, but it left a quiet imprint, proof that across the North Atlantic, longships reached these shores centuries before later empires sailed west in force. Picture the creak of a hull at anchor, the scent of tar and wool, the brief spark when a hammer struck iron on that far edge of the sea. Across the continents, diversity bloomed, hundreds of languages, distinct homelands, and webs of exchange. Along the Pacific, cedar canoes rode cold swells. In the Southwest, farmers coaxed maize, beans, and squash from arid ground. On the eastern woodlands, long houses stretched beneath maple and oak. Societies rose and reshaped themselves, sometimes dispersing under the push of drought or conflict, sometimes gathering in new constellations. The rhythm was human, adaptation, memory, renewal. Block 2, 1492 to 1607, worlds meet, breathe in, and picture a dark horizon sprinkled with lanterns. 3 small ships tilt and creak across a warm sea, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, carrying sailors who still think Asia waits over the edge of night. In October 1492, they reach islands now known as the Bahamas, then Hispaniola, and a door swings wide that will never close again. 4 voyages in all will follow, stitching the Caribbean to Europe and soon to Africa in new and troubling ways. When those lanterns arrived, they did not just bring men and flags. They carried seeds and animals tucked into hull and hay, iron and written prayers, ambitions and habits, and, invisibly, microbes. Historians call the resulting web, the Columbian Exchange, a mingling of plants, animals, ideas, and diseases between once separated worlds. Maize, potatoes, and tomatoes would remake old world diets. Horses, cattle, pigs, and wheat would remake new world landscapes. The consequences would be intimate and immense, a biological conversation that reshaped every shore it touched. The first test ground was the Caribbean. On Hispaniola, Spanish towns rose early, and systems of tribute and coerced labor encomienda were imposed under royal authority. For indigenous Taino communities, that meant back-breaking work and the pain of a world made unfamiliar. The island would anchor Spain's outward push into the continents, even as it echoed with dissent and debate over the ethics of conquest. Alongside new crops and new rules came something no village had asked for: smallpox and other crowd diseases with deep Old World histories. These infections arrived in the 16th century and spread along trade routes and footpaths with terrible speed, moving ahead of soldiers and alongside missionaries. Different places suffered differently, but the pattern was cruelly common waves of sickness entering immunologically naive communities. It's quiet in the middle of the night. Let that quiet stand in for stories not always recorded. Fevers, caretaking, songs sung to the sick. Beyond islands and ports, ships' wakes widened. North of the Caribbean, European empires felt their way along coasts and rivers, sometimes with boldness, often with hesitation. Spain moved first in force. To the southeast, St. Augustine took root in 1565, becoming the oldest continuously occupied European established settlement in the continental United States. The town lay on a low tidal shore, a defensive bead on Spain's maritime necklace, protecting treasure fleets that crawled up the Atlantic like shining beetles. Later, the stout star-shaped Castillo de San Marcos would anchor that coast, its pale coquina walls stubbornly absorbing cannon fire. To the north of Florida, France briefly planted a different flag. In 1564, at the River of Mainau, the St. John's French Huguenots built Fort Caroline, a refuge and a challenge to Spain's claim. It did not last. Spanish troops seized the site the following year. Yet, for a moment, the breeze above the marsh carried French hymns and the soft clatter of trade with Timucua neighbors. Spain's reach pressed inland as well. In the 1530s and 1540s, expeditions trudged across vast zones where indigenous nations had long traded, farmed, hunted, and governed. Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast with hundreds of men and horses, crossing rivers and chiefdoms. He died near the Mississippi in 1542. The expedition battered and diminished. Farther west, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led riders onto the high plains and into the southwest, chasing tales of Cibola and finding instead the endurance of Puebloan and plains communities whose lives were ordered by cycles of corn, bison, and ceremony. By the century's end, Spain established a more permanent presence in the northern Rio Grande Valley. In 1598, Juan de Oñate led a colonizing caravan along El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, founding the first Spanish capital near Ocay Owingue, then called San Juan Pueblo. The trail tied New Mexico to Mexico City, a long thread of wagons, hoofprints, and prayers that would be tugged for centuries first by Spain, then Mexico, then the United States. The new colony pressed into a dense tapestry of pueblos and other nations, adding missions, outposts, and friction to an ancient landscape. France, meanwhile, learned the breathing of the St. Lawrence. In the 1530s and 1540s, Jacques Cartier probed its tides, anchoring later French claims that would crystallize into New France after 1600. Quebec would not be founded until 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, just outside our chapter's date range, but already the river's cold light drew fishermen, traders, and cartographers and linked French fortunes to indigenous partners. And England? Its first lasting foothold would not come until 1607, but the island kingdom tested Atlantic waters earlier. In 1497, John Cabot sailed west from Bristol and kissed some northern shore Newfoundland, Labrador, or Cape Breton, before vanishing again into the archives of speculation and fishery. A century later, English efforts stumbled at Roanoke on the Carolina coast. The colony planted in 1587 was gone by 1590, leaving only a carved word and centuries of wondering. The ocean keeps its secrets, even when we ask politely. The human story behind these flags is thick with meetings, barter on a beach, a catechism in a mission room, a tense council beneath painted poles, a shared hunt that makes strangers almost friends. It is also thick with misunderstandings and violence, where European shore parties saw empty ground ready for claims. They were walking into homelands mapped by kinship and story, where a captain raised a cross or flag, local leaders weighed risks, opportunities, and the obligation to protect their people. Even when trade seemed simple iron for furs, glass beads for food, new goods rippled through old economies, unsettling balances near and far. As the 16th century waned, you can imagine a traveler standing at a harbor mouth at dusk. Behind them, a town of red roofs and narrow streets, candles burning in windows. Before them, a bay flecked with anchors. Perhaps Spanish in Florida. Perhaps French scouts considering the St. Lawrence. Perhaps anthem English mariners plotting a new attempt after Roanoke's silence. The wind smells of tar and salt. Somewhere inland, a Pueblo plaza settles toward sleep. A Timucua village listens to frogs. On the Grand Banks, fishermen split cod by lamplight. Worlds have met. The next century will braid them tighter by force and by choice. For our purposes, we can pause on the threshold of 1607, with 3 English ships nosing up the James River, looking for a place to tie their hopes. That is where our next night will begin. Block 3, 1607-1680, Planting Colonies. The river is still, fringed with reeds that sigh when the tide turns. In May 1607, 3 English ships anchor at a low peninsula in the James River, and the settlers begin to raise crude palisades. This is Jamestown, the first enduring English settlement on the continent. It begins not with triumph, but with hunger. Within months, most of the colonists are sick. The starving time of 1609 to 1610 will see desperate measures, roots, leather, anything to stay alive. Yet the place endures, in part because of uneasy ties with the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Algonquian-speaking towns under the paramount chief Wahunsenacao. Diplomacy and conflict interlace, gifts exchanged, then arrows, then truces again. Out of the swampy soil grows something that changes everything: tobacco. By the 1610s, colonist John Rolfe experiments with West Indian strains, producing a leaf sweet enough for English tastes. Tobacco becomes Virginia's gold, and the colony's fields expand. In 1619, two milestones shape its future: the first representative assembly in English America, the House of Burgesses, and the arrival of the first recorded Africans at Point Comfort, some of them enslaved. Two legacies, freedom and bondage, set down roots on the same shore. Further north, another experiment begins. In 1620, the Mayflower crosses rough autumn seas and lands at Cape Cod. The passengers, some seeking religious freedom, others simply a new start, sign the Mayflower Compact, pledging to govern together. At Plymouth, they meet the Wampanoag, whose Sachem Massasoit forges an alliance. The first winter is brutal. Survival is possible only with native knowledge of local crops and fishing grounds. Each November, many recall a first Thanksgiving, though the actual feast in 1621 was more a diplomatic celebration than a holiday, woven of goodwill but shadowed by fragile balance. Soon, more ships arrive, carrying waves of Puritans who dream of a city upon a hill. By 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded, led by John Winthrop. Towns spread outward, meeting houses rise, schools and Harvard College follow, yet religious unity proves elusive. Dissenters like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are banished, and from their exile grows Rhode Island, a haven of religious toleration. Connecticut and New Hampshire take shape as well, born of disputes and new opportunities. Each colony writes its own charter, its own vision of order. Not all planting is English. To the west of the Hudson, New Netherland grows from Dutch trade. In 1626, the story goes, the Dutch purchased the island of Manhattan. At the tip rises New Amsterdam with its windmills, canals, and a population as diverse as any seaport in Europe. Swedes settle briefly along the Delaware, found in New Sweden in 1638. But competition is sharp. By 1664, the English seize New Amsterdam, renaming it New York, and swallow New Sweden, too. Still, Dutch and Swedish footprints linger in language, in houses, in place names. Tensions ripple. In New England, the 1630s bring the Pequot War, a brutal conflict over trade, land, and sovereignty. The English, allied with Narragansett and Mohegan, devastate the Pequot people. In the Chesapeake, quarrels over territory spark skirmishes with Powhatan's successors. Violence coexists with intermarriage, diplomacy, and shared markets, but the scars remain. By the 1640s and 1650s, new colonies appear. Maryland is founded by the Calvert family as a refuge for English Catholics, though Protestant settlers soon outnumber them. Carolina begins as a proprietary venture, its rice fields shaped by knowledge enslaved Africans bring from West Africa. In the north, hardy farmers push into New England uplands. In the south, plantations edge closer to Spanish Florida. Daily life is diverse and demanding. In a New England village, the bell calls to meeting, and long sermons fill Sunday hours. In Virginia, planters tally tobacco hogsheads bound for London. Along Dutch streets in Manhattan, traders haggle in many tongues. Women labor in fields and kitchens, shaping survival as much as men. Native nations adapt too, some forging alliances, some resisting, some retreating westward under pressure. Every shoreline hums with negotiation. The decades close with instability. In Virginia, Bacon's rebellion in 1676 erupts. Planters and former indentured servants rise against the colonial elite and against native communities, burning Jamestown before the revolt collapses. The rebellion unsettles the ruling class and accelerates a shift toward enslaved African labor, judged by elites as more controllable than white indentured workers. Elsewhere, colonists and indigenous nations test fragile arrangements, some cooperative, others fraught. By 1680, English colonies string the coast from New England to the Carolinas. Spain guards Florida and New Mexico. France probes Canada, and Dutch traces remain. The continent is no blank slate. It is a crowded canvas of cultures old and new. Yet in each colony, people tell themselves they are planting beginnings. Some dream of freedom, some of profit, some of glory. In the soft quiet of night, imagine the smell of wood smoke curling from a chimney, the creak of a wharf, the rustle of maize fields, the whisper of prayers carried across the ocean and spoken anew beneath unfamiliar stars. Block 4, 1680, 1750, a growing unequal world night deepens, and the colonies stretch like strings of lanterns along the coast. By 1680, English settlements are well-rooted, yet still fragile. Populations climb, fields expand, and harbors churn with trade. Beneath the surface, divisions widen between rich and poor, between free and enslaved, between indigenous nations and newcomers. The story grows more crowded and less equal. Enslavement takes hold. In the early Chesapeake, planters once relied heavily on indentured servants Europeans who labored for years to earn freedom. But after Bacon's rebellion in 1676, elite landowners grew wary of restless servants. They turned increasingly toward African slavery as a more permanent, inheritable form of labor. Laws hardened, defining status by race and binding children to the condition of their mothers. Ships of the transatlantic slave trade moored at Virginia and Carolina wharves, unloading men, women, and children torn from West African coasts. Enslaved people brought with them languages, skills, and traditions rice cultivation in Carolina, ironworking, songs, and stories that survived even in bondage. Their presence reshaped economies and cultures even as chains sought to silence them. Frontier pressures farther inland, settlers pressed against boundaries. Native nations met this pressure in many ways, resisting, accommodating, moving west, or weaving new alliances. In 1680, in the arid valleys of New Mexico, Pueblo peoples rose together in the Pueblo Revolt. Led by a religious leader named Pope, they drove Spanish colonists and missionaries out, dismantling churches and restoring kivas. For more than a decade, the Pueblos maintained independence before Spain returned with negotiated settlements. The revolt remains one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history, a reminder that European power was never uncontested. Fear and fervor. In New England, the 1690s flickered with fear. At Salem, Massachusetts, accusations of witchcraft spiraled in 1692. Neighbors testified against neighbors. Courts filled. More than 20 people were executed before the panic ebbed. Behind the trials lay social tensions, frontier wars, crop failures, disputes between towns. Though brief, Salem left deep shadows, teaching later generations how easily fear could warp justice. Awakening. By the early 1700s, the colonies grew more populous, more diverse, and more self-confident. Immigrants arrived not only from England, but also from Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and beyond. New towns dotted Pennsylvania and the backcountry. Amid this growth, religion stirred anew in the first great awakening of the 1730s and 1740s. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield spoke with fiery urgency, insisting that faith must be personal and heartfelt, not just formal ritual. Crowds gathered in fields and meeting houses, swayed by sermons about sin, redemption, and grace. The awakening fractured old churches, empowered new voices, and planted seeds of questioning authority that would later echo in politics as well as faith. Imperial wars, colonial lives across the Atlantic, European empires clashed again and again, and the colonies were drawn in. The late 1600s and early 1700s brought a chain of imperial wars: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, extensions of conflicts in Europe. In North America, these wars meant raids on frontier villages, shifting alliances with native nations, and bloody struggles for control of Canada and the Caribbean. Colonists lived with the sense that distant monarchs pulled strings that jerked their everyday lives. Unequal worlds. By 1750, population in the English colonies topped 1 million. Wealth was unevenly spread. Grand plantations in the south, bustling merchant towns in the north, and scattered subsistence farms on the edge of settlement. Slavery was entrenched from Maryland southward, shaping politics and culture. In New England, towns prized literacy and communal order. Pennsylvania grew on principles of tolerance and Quaker peace, though not without tension. Everywhere, indigenous nations calculated responses: diplomacy, migration, resistance, trying to preserve autonomy in a world closing in. The colonies were no longer tenuous outposts. They were societies in their own right, with distinct accents, customs, and ambitions. Yet they remained colonies, their fates entangled with distant kings and councils. In the quiet of the night, imagine a candlelit parlor where a merchant counts his ledgers, a field where enslaved workers hum softly to endure another day, a pueblo plaza where old stories are told beside a rekindled fire, a village green where children chase one another at dusk. Unequal, diverse, restless. This was the seedbed of a new century. Block 5, 1754-1775, From Frontier War to Imperial Crisis. The forests of North America are wide, green oceans. In 1754, the quiet of these woods breaks with the crack of muskets. Rival empires Britain and France clash once more, each with indigenous allies, in what becomes known as the French and Indian War, the North American front of the wider 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War, 1763. The war begins in the Ohio Valley, where French forts and British settlers collide over rivers and trade. A young George Washington, then only in his 20s, leads a skirmish near Fort Duquesne, sparking conflict that spreads like wildfire. Soon, battles rage from the Canadian frontier to the Caribbean seas. Native nations weigh their choices carefully. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy seeks neutrality when possible, while groups like the Huron and Algonquin side with the French, and others, such as the Catawba, fight with the British. For them, the war is not just about European crowns, but about protecting homelands and balancing threats. After years of brutal fighting, the Treaty of Paris, 1763, redraws the map. France cedes Canada and lands east of the Mississippi to Britain, while Spain gives Florida to Britain, but gains Louisiana. On paper, Britain rules vast new territories. In reality, indigenous nations still command their own lands, and the new rulers must reckon with them. A fragile peace, victory is expensive. Britain is deep in debt and must garrison troops across the continent. Colonists expect to move westward into the fertile Ohio Valley, but indigenous nations resist. In 1763, Pontiac's rebellion and alliance of Great Lakes tribes besieges forts and raid settlements, forcing the British to reconsider. To calm the frontier, London issues the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains and forbidding colonial settlement beyond it. For native nations, it is a temporary safeguard. For settlers, it feels like a betrayal land denied after blood spilled. Taxes and protests, debt also leads Britain to seek new revenue from its colonies. Acts are passed. The Sugar Act, 1764, the Stamp Act, 1765, duties on paper, glass, and tea. For the colonists, these taxes sting less in money than in principle. They argue they are taxed without representation in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Protests flare. The Stamp Act Congress petitions the Crown. Merchants boycott British goods. Across taverns and town squares, debates sharpen. In Boston, resentment simmers hottest. In 1770, a tense crowd confronts British soldiers. Snowballs turn to stones and shots ring out. The Boston Massacre leaves 5 colonists dead. The event is seized upon by patriots like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, who spread engravings and fiery words. The colonies are still loyal in name, but trust erodes. Tea and defiance. In 1723, Parliament grants the struggling East India Company the right to sell tea directly, undercutting local merchants. Colonists see it as another insult. That December, in the harbor at Boston, men disguised as Mohawks climb aboard ships and spill 342 chests of tea into dark water. The Boston Tea Party shocks London. In response, Britain passes the coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, closing Boston's port and tightening royal control. To many colonists, it feels like chains being fastened. Toward revolution, in 1774, delegates from 12 colonies meet in Philadelphia as the First Continental Congress. They send petitions to the king, organize boycotts, and quietly prepare for defense. Voices differ. Some plead for reconciliation. Others whisper of independence. But unity, fragile and new, begins to grow. Then, April 1775, British troops march from Boston to seize arms at Concord. On the village green at Lexington, shots crack in the dawn, the shot heard round the world. The revolution has begun. Farmers with muskets chase redcoats back to the city, and the colonies cross a threshold they cannot uncross. The night before, imagine the quiet of a colonial house in the mid-1770s. A mother tucks children into bed, while in the next room men debate liberty and loyalty. Outside, lanterns swing in the night breeze. No one knows the outcome, whether they will remain subjects of a king or risk everything for a republic. The air is thick with uncertainty, but also with possibility. The colonies are no longer only planted outposts. They are restless societies, ready to define themselves. The years ahead will bring revolution, sacrifice, and birth. But on the eve of it all, the night is still, waiting for history to unfold. Block 612, 1775, 1703, Revolution. The night of April 18, 1775 is clear and cool. Across the Massachusetts countryside, riders whisper warnings. The regulars are coming. Lanterns gleam in church towers. Muskets are lifted from mantles. By dawn, at Lexington Green, British soldiers face a small line of colonial militia. No one knows who fires first, but the crack of gunpowder shatters the quiet. 8 colonists fall. Hours later, at Concord's North Bridge, militias push the British back, and soon thousands swarm the roads, turning the redcoat retreat into chaos. What begins as a skirmish grows into war. A Continental Army in Philadelphia that summer, the Second Continental Congress convenes. Voices are divided. Some still hope for peace with Britain. Others press for boldness. They appoint George Washington commander-in-chief of a new Continental Army. He takes command outside Boston, a tall Virginian in blue and buff uniform, learning to mold farmers into soldiers. Meanwhile, colonists send the olive branch petition to King George III, pleading for reconciliation. The king refuses. The die is cast. Common sense and independence. In January 1796, a slim pamphlet appears in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In plain, fiery language, it declares monarchy absurd and independence necessary. It spreads like wildfire, read aloud in taverns, copied in newspapers, passed from hand to hand. The idea of separation no longer seems radical, it seems inevitable. On July 4th, 1776, Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson, revised by Franklin, Adams, and others. Its words are steady as Scripture, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derive power from the consent of the governed. Bells ring, crowds cheer, though in truth many remain fearful. Independence is proclaimed, but survival is uncertain. The struggle for survival. The war is not a straight line of victories. In 1776, British forces seize New York City, scattering Washington's army. Snow falls as soldiers trudge barefoot, morale low. Yet on Christmas night, Washington leads a daring crossing of the Delaware River, surprising Hessian troops at Trenton. A small victory, but it breathes life into the cause. The war spreads. In the north, Americans capture a British army at Saratoga, 1777, a turning point that convinces France to join as an ally. French fleets and funds tilt the balance, adding global weight to what began as a colonial rebellion. In the South, the conflict grows bitter. Loyalists and patriots clash in Civil War fashion, neighbor against neighbor. Enslaved people seize opportunities to flee, some joining British lines in exchange for promises of freedom. Native nations, too, weigh choices, often siding with Britain to resist colonial expansion, knowing independence for the colonies may mean further loss of their homelands. Winter hardships. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-78, the Continental Army shivers in makeshift huts. Food is scarce, disease spreads, yet amid the hardship comes discipline. The Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, drills the soldiers, teaching them to march, wheel, and fight as a unified army. Out of frost and hunger, a new strength is forged toward victory. By 1781, the war's tide turns. British General Cornwallis fortifies at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington marches south with French allies, while the French Navy blocks the bay. In October, trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis surrenders. The fields echo with drums and fife, redcoats stacking arms as American and French troops look on. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, ends the war. Britain recognizes American independence, ceding lands to the Mississippi. The United States is born, not from ease, but from sacrifice. The human cost. Yet behind the grand story lie quieter truths. Soldiers who never returned. Women who managed farms, shops, and supply lines while husbands fought. Enslaved people who gambled on freedom and often found chains again. Native nations whose lands were claimed without their consent. The Revolution created a republic, but not equality for all. Night Reflections. As you settle toward rest, imagine a campfire at Yorktown after the surrender, the crackle of wood, the smell of smoke, the murmur of exhausted men staring into embers. Around them lies a continent altered forever. They cannot yet see the struggles of building a government or the contradictions that remain. But for a moment, the night holds something rare, the sound of silence after victory. Block 7, 1787 to 1848, founding to market revolution. The war has ended, but peace brings new uncertainty. 13 states stretch along the Atlantic, linked loosely by the Articles of Confederation. The Union feels fragile, each state jealous of its power. Congress unable to tax or enforce decisions. Farmers protest debts in events like Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Marching against courts and creditors. The dream of independence trembles, threatened not by kings, but by disunity. The Constitution, 1787 to 1791. In the summer heat of 1787, delegates gather in Philadelphia. Windows are shuttered, debates long. Some favor strong central authority, others fear tyranny. Compromises take shape. A bicameral legislature balancing large and small states, a presidency limited but energetic, courts to interpret the law. On September 17th, they sign the Constitution of the United States. It still needs ratification, and fierce arguments rage. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, defend the new framework. By 1789, the Constitution is in effect. 2 years later, the Bill of Rights' 10 amendments guaranteeing speech, press, religion, and more soothes anxieties and secures liberties. The first president, George Washington, becomes the first president serving 2 terms. He sets precedents forming a cabinet, stepping down after 8 years. Under his watch, the Capitol rises on the banks of the Potomac. His farewell warns against factions and foreign entanglements, advice not always heeded. John Adams follows, steering through storms with France, passing the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, testing the limits of dissent. Then comes Thomas Jefferson, who envisions a republic of farmers. In 1803, he orchestrates the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size and sending Lewis and Clark westward to map rivers and mountains, meeting native nations whose worlds long predated the stars and stripes. Native nations and removal expansion carries cost. Settlers push across Appalachians, clashing with native peoples. Some nations resist, others negotiate, but pressure never relents. In 1830, under Andrew Jackson, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, forcing tribes from ancestral lands east of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, despite appealing to the Supreme Court, are driven west on the Trail of Tears, a march of death and sorrow. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole endure similar fates. The promise of liberty for settlers becomes devastation for native nations, markets and machines. Meanwhile, America transforms within. The early 1800s bring the market revolution new roads, canals like the Erie Canal, and steamboats link regions. Factories hum in New England, spinning textiles. Cotton spreads across the South, tied to enslaved labor and the booming transatlantic market. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, intensifies demand for enslaved workers, embedding slavery deeper into the nation's economy. Cities swell. Immigrants arrive from Ireland and Germany, filling docks and workshops. A restless energy thrums in America, more connected, more commercial, and more unequal. Reform and renewal. With change comes questioning. The Second Great Awakening stirs revivals across frontier camps and town greens, urging personal faith and moral reform. From its energy grow movements for temperance, for women's rights, for abolition of slavery. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, reformers led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott declare that all men and women are created equal, echoing Jefferson's words across gender lines. Abolitionists, too, raise their voices louder. William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator. Frederick Douglass speaks of slavery's cruelty from personal memory. Change feels possible, though resistance is fierce. War with Mexico. The nation's hunger for land reaches south and west. In 1846, after annexing Texas, the U.S. goes to war with Mexico. Soldiers march, cannons roar, and by 1848 the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transfers vast lands California, New Mexico, Arizona, and more. The map expands, but questions sharpen. Will slavery spread into these new territories? The question will haunt the Republic. Night Reflections. By 1848, America is a nation transformed, from fragile union to continental power. Yet beneath the pride runs tension. Enslaved millions labor under bondage, even as reformers cry for freedom. Native nations grieve lost homelands. Women demand voices long denied. Farmers, merchants, and workers navigate a world of canals, rails, and restless markets. In the quiet of evening, picture a canal boat rocking gently, lanterns glowing on the water. A family speaks in German on the deck, new arrivals chasing promise. Somewhere in Cherokee country, a fire burns low as elders remember lands left behind. In a New England mill, looms clatter late into the night, young women singing softly to keep rhythm. This is the United States growing, striving, divided, alive. Block 8, 1848-1877, house divided by mid-19th century, the United States stretches from ocean to ocean. The dream of expansion has been realized, but so has its cost. Every new state, every new territory raises the same urgent question. Will slavery spread, or will it stop? The nation swells with pride and unease, progress and fracture, a house built on shaky ground. Sectional strains. In 1850, Congress passes a fragile compromise. California enters free. The Fugitive Slave Act strengthens slaveholders' power, demanding that even in the North, escaped people must be returned. The law hardens hearts abolitionists resist. Underground railroad networks grow bolder, and free black communities fear capture. Literature fuels the debate. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin stirs sympathy and outrage, painting slavery's cruelty in unforgettable scenes. In Kansas, the issue turns violent, bleeding Kansas, where settlers clash with rifles and torches over whether the territory will be slave or free. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court declares that African Americans, enslaved or free, cannot be citizens, and that Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories. The ruling deepens division, convincing many Northerners that the system is rigged toward bondage. Toward war, the 1860 election brings Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. Southern leaders fear his opposition to slavery's expansion. One by one, Southern states secede, forming the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate guns fire on Fort Sumter, and war begins. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. At first, many believe the conflict will be short. Instead, it becomes a long and bloody struggle, the deadliest war in American history. In the East, battles rage at Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg. In the West, Union armies seize the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy. On the seas, ironclads clash, signaling a new age of naval warfare. The human toll is staggering, hundreds of thousands killed, families torn apart. Farms, cities, and railroads become battlefields. Emancipation in 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebelling states to be free. It is both a moral and strategic step. redefining the war as a fight not only for union, but for liberty. Enslaved men and women take freedom into their own hands, fleeing plantations, joining Union lines, and reshaping the conflict. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served the Union cause, fighting for the promise of freedom. The war's end. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Muskets fall silent. The Union is preserved, but the cost is immense. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater, leaving the nation stunned in grief. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Peace is not simple. The nation must decide what freedom means. Reconstruction begins, aiming to rebuild the South and secure rights for freed people. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th grants citizenship. The 15th protects voting rights for black men. For a time, African Americans serve in legislatures, establish schools, and build churches with renewed hope. Yet opposition is fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan spread terror. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws seek to limit freedom. By 1877, federal troops withdraw from the South, and Reconstruction collapses into a patchwork of gains and betrayals. Freedom has been proclaimed, but equality remains unfinished. Night Reflections. Imagine the hush after battlefields are abandoned, grass growing over trenches, rivers washing away powder. Enslaved families once separated now search for one another, their names carried in whispers and letters. A soldier limps home to a farm changed by years of absence. In Congress, lawmakers argue over the meaning of citizenship, even as freed children open spellers in makeshift classrooms. The war has ended, but the questions of justice, belonging, and equality remain. America has survived being divided, but it carries scars that shape every dream and every debate yet to come. Block 9, 1877-1914, Gilded Age and Progressivism. The guns of the Civil War are silent, but the echoes linger. America steps into a new age, one of steel and smoke, fortunes and poverty, hope and unrest. The period after Reconstruction is often called the Gilded Age. Gilded because the surface gleams with prosperity, yet underneath lie cracks of hardship and inequality. Railroads and industry. Across the continent, railroads stitch the land together. The transcontinental line, completed in 1869, links Atlantic to Pacific. Trains carry settlers west, grain east, and herds of cattle north and south. Towns spring up by the tracks, while telegraph wires hum with messages. Steel, oil, and coal fuel growth. Giants like Andrew Carnegie in steel and John D. Rockefeller in oil build empires. Their names gleam, but their workers toil long hours in factories, mines, and mills, often for meager pay. Cities swell with immigrants, Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, Eastern European crowding into tenements, seeking opportunity amid hardship. The human cost. In mines of Pennsylvania, men descend into darkness. In New York, sweatshops, young women stitch clothes by gaslight. Children work beside parents, their laughter hushed by exhaustion. Laborers organize, demanding shorter hours and safer conditions. Strikes flare the Haymarket Affair in 1886, the Pullman Strike in 1894. Sometimes protests win reforms, other times they are crushed with violence. Westward expansion and conflict in the West, expansion continues. Buffalo herds vanish under hunters' rifles, devastating plains nations. Native resistance endures, but by the 1890s, most tribes are confined to reservations. In 1890, tragedy strikes at Wounded Knee, where U.S. troops kill hundreds of Lakota, marking the last major clash of the Indian Wars. The frontier, once romanticized as endless, is declared closed. Immigration and cities newcomers pour into ports like Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco. They bring languages, recipes, and traditions that transform American culture, yet they also meet suspicion, prejudice, and restrictive laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In cities, electric lights flicker on for the first time. Streetcars rattle, skyscrapers rise, steel skeletons reaching for the sky. Amid grime and noise, reformers work to ease suffering. Jane Addams opens Hull House in Chicago, offering aid and education to immigrants. The progressive spirit. By the turn of the century, reform gathers strength. The progressive movement seeks to rein in big business, fight corruption, and improve living conditions. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt speak of a square deal, busting monopolies and conserving natural treasures. National parks expand, protecting mountains, forests, and rivers for generations. Progressives push for clean water, food safety laws, and child labor restrictions. Journalists, known as muckrakers, expose scandals in factories, meatpacking plants, and city halls. Ordinary citizens join unions, women's clubs, and civic leagues to demand fairness. A changing nation. By 1914, America has changed beyond recognition from the days of muskets and wagons. It is a nation of railroads, factories, and cities buzzing with electricity. It is also a nation of tensions, wealth against poverty, reform against corruption, inclusion against exclusion. In the soft quiet of night, picture a train station where immigrants step onto a platform clutching worn suitcases. Picture a homesteader staring at endless prairie sky, a factory girl walking home beneath the new glow of electric lamps, a Lakota elder remembering the buffalo that once thundered across the plains. This is the Gilded Age, dazzling and harsh, restless and alive. Block 10, 1914 and 1945, Global Wars and Depression. The 20th century dawns with America bustling and ambitious. Cities glow with electric lights, factories hum, and immigrants fill streets with many languages. Yet beyond the horizon, storms gather wars abroad, hardship at home, and challenges that will shape the nation's destiny. The First World War, 1914 to 1918. In 1914, war erupts in Europe. At first, the United States remains neutral, but the seas grow dangerous. German submarines sink ships, including the Lusitania. Telegrams hint at secret threats. By 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. American troops doughboys cross the Atlantic. In muddy trenches, they face gas, artillery, and exhaustion. Yet their arrival tilts the balance. In 1918, the Allies triumph, and the armistice falls silent over battlefields scarred with craters and wire. Back home, President Woodrow Wilson dreams of a new international order, proposing the League of Nations. But Congress refuses to join. America retreats into cautious isolation even as the world changes. The roaring 20s peace brings prosperity, at least for some. The 1920s roar with jazz, radios, and motion pictures. Cities dance with flappers and swing. Automobiles roll off assembly lines, carrying families to suburbs and countryside. Yet the decade is also shadowed. Prohibition bans alcohol but fuels speakeasies and organized crime. The Ku Klux Klan rises again, spreading hate. Immigration laws tighten, shutting doors to many. And on farms, falling prices sow quiet hardship even amid urban glitter. The Great Depression, 1929, 1939. In October 1929, the stock market crashes. Fortunes vanish overnight. Banks fail, factories close, millions lose jobs. Bread lines stretch through city streets. Families huddle in shacks called Hoovervilles. Dust storms roll over the Great Plains, blackening skies and driving farmers from the land. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt becomes president. His New Deal launches public works, Social Security, and financial reforms. Workers build dams, schools, and roads. Artists paint murals and write songs for government projects. It is not a full cure, but it lifts spirits, proving that government can act in times of despair. World War II, 1939-1945. Even as America rebuilds, another global storm rises. In 1939, war begins in Europe. The U.S. stays neutral at first, sending supplies to Britain and allies. But on December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bomb Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, America enters World War II. Factories roar again, producing tanks, planes, and ships. Women join the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter, with her rolled-up sleeve, becomes a symbol of strength. Soldiers sail to distant fronts, deserts of North Africa, islands of the Pacific, beaches of Normandy. The war is vast and terrible. Millions perish in Europe and Asia. The world learns of the Holocaust, where Nazi Germany murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. In 1945, after years of brutal fighting, the U.S. drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. The war ends, but a new atomic age begins. Night Reflections. From 1914 to 1945, America passes through fire, from hesitant neutral to global power, from glittering prosperity to crushing depression, from isolation to world leadership. Imagine the hush of a jazz club in the 1920s, trumpets fading as couples step into midnight streets. Picture a dust storm swallowing a Kansas farm, fields turned to shadows. Hear the whistle of a factory in 1943, women and men working through the night. And at last, the quiet after victory in 1945, a soldier stepping off a ship, suitcase in hand, uncertain of what peace will bring. The world is forever changed, and America, too. The stage is set for the Cold War, for struggles of equality at home, for decades of transformation yet to come. Block 11, 1945-1980, Cold War and Civil Rights. The war is over. Soldiers return, cities celebrate, and the United States stands stronger than ever before. Yet victory brings not only relief, but also new burdens. A new rivalry takes shape, stretching across oceans and decades. The Cold War. At the same time at home, millions demand the promises of freedom finally be fulfilled. Cold War shadows. In 1945, former allies soon become rivals. The Soviet Union and the United States divide Europe into spheres, and an iron curtain falls across the continent. The world watches as two superpowers face each other, not always in open battle, but in constant tension. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine pledges to contain communism. In 1949, NATO forms. In the same year, the Soviet Union tests an atomic bomb. The Korean War, 1950 and 1953, erupts, ending in stalemate with a divided peninsula. At home, fear of spies and subversion fuels the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy claims communists lurk everywhere, and careers crumble under suspicion. The civil rights movement, meanwhile, a different struggle grows louder. In 1954, the Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board of Education that school segregation is unconstitutional. The decision sparks hope and fierce resistance. In 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. The boycott that follows lifts a young preacher, Martin Luther King, Jr., into national prominence. Nonviolent marches, sit-ins, and freedom rides spread across the South. The nation watches as protesters face fire hoses and dogs, as voices sing, "We shall overcome." In 1963, King speaks before the Lincoln Memorial. "I have a dream." The words echo into hearts across the world. Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and 1965 ban segregation and protect voting rights. Yet the struggle is not finished. Poverty, discrimination, and violence continue. But a door has opened, and it will not be shut again. Other currents of change. The 1960s bring turbulence. Young people question war, inequality, and authority. Music blares from radios, rock and folk songs of protest and hope. Women organize for equality, building on the legacy of Seneca Falls. Latino activists, Native leaders, and gay rights pioneers raise their voices. America is restless, searching. At the same time, the Cold War intensifies. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brings the world close to nuclear war. In the 1960s and 1970s, U.S. forces fight in Vietnam, a long and bitter conflict that divides the nation. Protests fill campuses and streets. Families watch nightly news of battles half a world away. Watergate and transition. The 1970s bring more shocks. The Watergate scandal forces President Richard Nixon to resign in 1974, shaking faith in government. Economic troubles, oil crises, inflation weigh heavily. Yet new movements thrive. Environmentalists win protections for air, water, and endangered species. Technology begins its quiet march from labs into daily life. Night reflections. Between 1945 and 1980, America is pulled between pride and doubt, progress and protest. It stands as a global superpower, yet struggles to keep its promises of equality at home. Picture a child in 1950s suburbia pedaling a bicycle past rows of new houses built for veterans. Picture marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, footsteps steady against fear. Picture a family gathered around a black and white television, listening as astronauts' voices crackle from the moon in 1969. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The Cold War still hums. The dream of justice still calls. The nation is in motion, unfinished, unsettled, alive. Block 12, 1980. Today, new economies, new voices. The Cold War still hums, but the America of the 1980s feels different, faster, louder, more global. Neon lights glow. Computers begin to shrink from rooms to desks, and new voices press forward in politics and culture, the Reagan era and the end of the Cold War. In 1981, Ronald Reagan becomes president, promising smaller government, lower taxes, and renewed strength. His policies, Reaganomics, reshaped the economy, favoring deregulation and free markets. He also expands military spending, challenging the Soviet Union in rhetoric and resources. By the late 1980s, the world shifts. Soviet reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost and perestroika, open doors. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. The Cold War ends not with a final battle, but with walls crumbling, nations reawakening, and a long rivalry fading into history. America stands as the world's lone superpower. New economies, new technologies. The 1990s bring economic growth and a digital dawn. Personal computers spread into homes and schools. The Internet connects people in ways unimaginable just decades before. Global trade expands, weaving economies together across oceans. Yet, new vulnerabilities appear. In 2001, on a clear September morning, planes strike the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The attacks kill thousands and shock the world. America enters a new era of conflict, the war on terror, with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, long struggles with heavy costs. Social change and cultural shifts. At home, movements for equality continue to reshape the nation. Women gain ground in politics and workplaces. The LGBTQ plus community fights for recognition and rights, with milestones like the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide in 2015. Racial justice remains a pressing cause, with marches, music, and voices demanding equality in schools, streets, and courts. Technology transforms daily life. Cell phones evolve into smartphones. Social media shrinks distances while stirring new debates. Factories give way to service and tech industries. Cities hum with startups, while rural communities often struggle to keep pace. Challenges and continuities. America faces new challenges: economic recessions, political polarization, climate change, and pandemics. Yet it also shows resilience. Scientists racing to create vaccines, citizens voting in record numbers, communities finding strength in one another. The questions that began centuries ago, liberty, equality, belonging, still echo. Whose voices are heard? Whose dreams are included? The answers shift with each generation. Night reflections. Picture a family in 1989 watching the Berlin Wall crack under hammers, children cheering as bricks fall. Picture a commuter in the 1990s hearing the dial-up hum of the internet for the first time. Picture the quiet of a New York street on September 12, 2001. Smoke still in the air, strangers helping strangers. Picture a crowd in 2015, tears streaming as couples marry under newly recognized rights. The story of America is never still. It is restless, striving, unfinished. Like the earliest peoples who crossed icy corridors, like colonists planting tobacco, or Puritans signing compacts, like reformers marching across bridges or astronauts stepping on lunar dust, Americans continue to carry forward, uncertain, hopeful, determined. And so, as night deepens, let the story rest here, not as an ending, but as a pause. The chapters ahead are unwritten, waiting for voices yet to be heard, dreams yet to be dreamed.